Welcome everybody. I'm Georgia. I'm a junior studying art history and international relations, and welcome to my art break. So in crafting this talk, I was really excited to bring together both these disciplines. But I first just want to say that what I love so much about art is there's never one right interpretation or one right way to look at a piece. So I want you to keep that in mind today as I take you through my own reading of a painting in the Anderson collection. And in that same spirit, I would really encourage you all to leave questions and observations in the chat as I go along. As you can see, you can all see each other's questions or observations. And I'll make space at several moments during my talk to read and answer these. And then after about 20 minutes, I'll open up the floor to you guys to lead the discussion wherever your curiosity lies with any further questions. I'm going to walk us through some of the most compelling happenings in both art history and IR during a particularly transformative time, right after World War II. I also just want to clarify that when I say IR, I mean international relations. Just easy, I can avoid the mouthful. I'll try to shed some light on the overlaps between these two domains where I see them, and use one of my favorite artworks in the collection and some IR buzzwords to do so. My hope is to contextualize this otherwise maybe puzzling piece of abstract art and allow you to develop your own responses to it and show you how the counsel of an IR model and an artistic movement can work together to uncover a possible response to a big question about our world. I also acknowledge we are all walking into this tour, so to speak, with different levels of knowledge about these two disciplines. So I just ask you to bear with me if anything I'm describing is something that you already know or understand. So I'll get us started with a little history. The world emerged battered and disheartened from the Second World War in 1945, with fragile economies, anxious and injured populations, and tenuous international relationships. The post-war period was marked, of course, by a sweeping feeling of loss and destruction, a sort of awestruck uncertainty in which people and countries struggled to find and establish their place in a profoundly altered world. A world altered not just by the tragedies of war, but also by the onset of a spirited power struggle that would dominate the social and political landscape of the following decades, which is what we now call the Cold War. Winston Churchill provided the world with a metaphor, probably one we've all heard by now, to describe the deep divisions he saw forming before him in 1946. He called the line between the East and the West, the boundary between Soviet and American spheres of influence, the Iron Curtain. Its manifestation in Europe is shown by the black line on this diagram. Scholars will probably never stop debating about the origins of this conflict, the breakdown of cooperation between the two states who emerged the strongest after the war. Were the United States and Soviet Union simply too power-hungry to coexist? Or were their ideologies too divergent and conflicting to tolerate? Or were their economies too mutually destructive to collaborate? Dealing with these questions represents one of the chief concerns of thinkers in the field of international relations, which is to explain and classify state behavior exactly like the actions by the US and the USSR, which brought on the Cold War, eventually so well that you can predict them. People have developed models to help with this, which form a theoretical basis of the study of IR today. There are three main paradigms, but the one I'm going to focus on now, because it directly involves art and culture, is constructivism. Scholars who operate under the constructivist model, like Alexander Wendt, the inventor of the term, believe state behavior is shaped by beliefs, collective norms, and social identities. Constructivists place heavy importance on ideas and discourse within nations when they analyze the motivations behind their choices, whereas peers in other schools of thought believe only power or money or markets or institutions drive state actions. For constructivists, features like religion, demographics, past decision-making, and other manifestations of societal norms like art and culture, hint, hint, predominantly account for and shape foreign policy. So in relation to the reasons I just gave for the onset of the Cold War, very much oversimplified into three words here: power, ideology, and economy, a constructivist thinker would point to the second ideology-based explanation as the most accurate, which is an outlook that would need to take into account art and culture in a nation in order to understand and predict its movements. And as I said before, this is only one approach to modeling interstate conduct, but let's continue working through it. Okay, I'll take a moment here to answer any questions that have come up so far. Thank you, Mackenzie, for putting that out there. Okay, if no one has any questions, that's all good. I'm sure more will come up. All right, so if norms and beliefs among the populace are the driving force of state actions, what are the belief systems at stake here that are so at odds? So at the risk of oversimplifying again, one way to classify the two nations' divergent ideologies is as collectivist in the Soviet Union and individualist in the United States. The Communist Party in the USSR pushed its constituents to lay down personal goals, desires, passions, feelings, and privileges in radical pursuit of the common good. In the United States, citizens were and are encouraged to do the opposite. The official American view at the time was that the common good was supported by everyone doing what they do best, pushing and bettering themselves, their own circumstances, and climbing independently to the highest rung of society possible with their own grit, their own passion, and their own hard work. In 1946, just a month before Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, George Kennan, an important American diplomat in Moscow, sent a letter to the US State Department warning of the potential dangers of this very ideological clash. Kennan's experience in the Soviet Union had led him to the conclusion that the Kremlin's designs were inherently aggressive, that they were, quote, impervious to the logic of reason, and that the only possible approach the United States could take was forceful resistance. He believed, rightly or not, that it was the outlook and custom of Soviet political leaders, the cultural norms, per se, that threatened the place of the United States on the international stage, and therefore the livelihoods of all Americans. And he believed direct, forceful confrontation was the inevitable result of this discord. So we're starting to see where a constructivist thinker would begin to collect her evidence and build her case in response to the big why question at the root of thinking about the Cold War. We're about to get to the painting, but I'm going to take another short pause here to answer a few more questions, if there are any. Okay. I know it's a lot, but okay, then I'll just move on. So let's talk about art. Pieces of media and culture can be incredibly useful resources for understanding the norms under which a society is operating. In this case, Soviet and American art, on the Soviet side, more like propaganda, gives color to the ideological differences I described a moment ago, as do the circumstances give color to the artworks themselves. It's a wonderful feedback loop in that way. Here is a Soviet propaganda poster from the early 1940s. So take a moment to observe. Notice the color palette, the uniformity of the three primary figures' dress, their expressions, the placement and position of their hands and legs. Notice the direction of their gaze, collectively up and away, just as the angle of their salute and the energetic forward motion in their bodies. How their leader, Joseph Stalin, and his predecessor, Vladimir Lenin, presides over them in an ominous red cloud, looking into the same future but without a body, more like a presence or a vision than an earthly comrade to the young people below. Think about what kind of mood this brings up for you. What kind of ideology might the maker and viewers of this poster have been accepting or endorsing? Please feel free to enter a word or phrase that comes to mind in the chat or just write it down to keep it with you. Powerful, yeah. Personally, when I look at this image, I see teamwork, youth, energy, joy, but I also sense a strong emphasis on obedience and conformity. And I see uniform, I see conformity, forward looking. And all these features seem to line up with collectivist ideology, which is the one held in high regard by Soviet leadership at the time. And whether the obedience indicates something more sinister, perhaps the aggression Kennan warned of, is definitely up for interpretation, but American politicians at the time surely thought so. So now comes a work that was most definitely not meant to be used as propaganda, but whose creator and his peers contributed to an artistic movement that came to embody, to sort of flex the creative muscles of the American ideology in play across the Atlantic from that red poster. This is a painting by Jackson Pollock that's currently hanging in the Anderson collection. A striking 8 3/4 feet long and 3.5 feet tall. It's also right behind me. You can see how it was hung in the gallery. So take a few moments to look at this closely, and then I'll zoom in and show you in some more detail. All right, here's a close-up. So what do you notice changed as you quote unquote approached? Maybe write down what you're thinking, or if you feel like it's shared in the chat. First impressions are often the most telling with works like these, and we'll come back to them later. So though I hope you've made some assessments yourselves, I'll offer a description of the piece through my eyes. Yeah, Kate said, I see more color than I expected. The texture is a little hard to pick up through the screen, but the piece is gritty, strings of color creating a raised web on the splotchy canvas. From afar, the colors seem earthy, natural, almost muted, with black and gray, the natural ivory of the canvas, and hints of moss green materializing in the tangles of paint. While I don't immediately see any recognizable figures or shapes, my PowerPoint app actually labeled this image as a tree or plant, which from afar I could potentially see, maybe a bird's nest or a muddled spider web. But then, upon looking closer, out comes every color of the rainbow in thin individual streaks laid sporadically across the canvas. Layered drips of thick black enamel form the base of the work, atop which threads of yellow, red, purple, blue, and orange oil paint create an intricate, unruly lattice. Frenzied and gloomy, yet delicate and bright. In contrast with the Soviet poster, nothing about this work feels uniform or sterile. There is no symmetry, no coordination of color or form. There are no blank spots, and there are also no solid swaths of color, just a continuous swarm of swipes, drips, and puddles. So, if nothing else, Jackson Pollock was individual. He pioneered his art form, which we now call action painting or abstract expressionism. His practice of moving about his studio, paintbrush and bucket in hand, tossing paint, enamel, sometimes even tar and gravel onto massive canvases was completely revolutionary. No one had ever done what he did. Here are a few photographs that give you a sense of Pollock's practice. As you can see, he laid his canvases on the ground rather than on the wall or an easel while he worked, stepping and crawling across them to deposit his specially mixed paint wherever he pleased. With his works, he turned inside out, listening to his mind and body, to internal artistic impulses that guided his movements. He led with emotion, waves of inspiration, and his subconscious. He would even drop cigarette butts and so-called trouser pocket paraphernalia, like nails, buttons, keys, and coins, and continue to paint straight over them. Accidentally or not, he allowed his canvases to absorb his possessions, whether peculiar or banal, and encompass not just what he was holding onto mentally, but also in his pockets. Clement Greenberg, a key art critic of the time, believed Pollock to be the greatest painter of his generation. In a paper revealingly titled American Type Painting, Greenberg outlined and promoted Pollock's work and that of his contemporaries for its inventiveness, freshness, and courageous plunge into the deep and pure individual inclination. And just as Pollock's work is about the individual, internal experience of the artist, his painting also produces an individual experience for every viewer. And it's for that reason that I encourage you to write down your first impressions of the piece before I discussed it. And I'd be surprised if any of your observations were exactly the same as any of mine. It is this singularity of Pollock as an artist, of his new approach to painting, of each work he and his peers created, and of all of us viewers' unique experiences of them, that places abstract expressionism so squarely back into this individualist American ideology that surfaced so strongly in the 1940s. Invention, emotion, the subconscious, these are all terms tightly linked with individuality, personal growth, and progress, just what the American dream holds so dear. And freedom, the capacity to opt in, to express oneself unhindered by pressures to conform or obey, these notions are all present here too. So let's go back to our constructivist model for a moment. We use these two pieces of visual culture as sources to reveal the intricacies of an ideological clash, which a constructivist thinker, one who points to norms and beliefs like the ones upheld by these two ideological structures, would cite as a driving force for state action, in this case, heated contention. The portfolio of Pollock and his action painter peers demonstrates and upholds this pervading norm of individualism in the United States, while the Soviet propaganda does the same for collectivism. In the end, employing artwork from both nations got us closer to an answer to our original big question of why these two nations just couldn't get along. And remember too, though, that feedback loop that I mentioned before, wherein artworks help us make sense of events and conditions of their time, as I just described, but so too do norms, history, and conditions of the international system help us approach and appreciate somewhat daunting pieces of abstract art like we have done today. So thank you all so much for listening and for your participation. I'd love to take some questions now, and if anything comes up later, here's my email. Definitely feel free to reach out. I'll wait and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, I'm not sure if my chat's just slow, but oh yeah. Amy said, did Pollock connect his work to politics? And no, he was extremely, his art practice was a very personal experience for him, and he never even really offered any sort of interpretation or explanation behind any of his works. As I said before, it was all about sort of his freedom of expression and his ability to sort of lay his emotions on the canvas. And he probably would have been, he definitely, as I said before, like did not intend for his work to become any sort of propaganda for the American dream or anything like that. But it is interesting that his sort of inclinations and his artistic style can be sort of interpreted in this way as to show us what was going on in the American ideology at the time. Chad said, why the name Lucifer? So I didn't include the name on purpose because I think it's very thought-provoking. And a lot of the names of Pollock's pieces, again, as I said, don't really have an explanation or an exact interpretation. And art historians have looked at this title in many different ways. And I'm not sure why the name Lucifer. I'm not sure anyone is. And I wanted to credit the work at the end, but the reason I didn't include it in the speech is because I think it brings in a lot of questions that are sort of difficult to answer without Pollock's own perspective on his decision to title his piece Lucifer. Kate said, do you know if Pollock's work was ever appropriated by the US government and used as propaganda? I'm not sure. I know that he was a very popular artist at the time. So he was a household name, and people knew about his work. It was very expensive and very, hard to get your hands on even at the time. But I'm not sure that the United States ever formally tried to use his work as propaganda or as some kind of advertisement for their Cold War efforts, but it would be interesting. I doubt Pollock would have allowed that to happen, but maybe. Thank you guys for all these questions. Marco said, were there any other pieces at the Anderson that you would have liked to talk about rather than Lucifer? There's a few other abstract expressionist works. There's actually one right there by de Kooning. And there's another Pollock and another de Kooning that are also from the late 40s that definitely fall into the same artistic movement as this piece. And I think the movement is what I really wanted to point to as sort of that evidence or that source for looking at American ideology. So yes, I definitely think that I could have included more pieces or focused on another one, just because gestural painting and action painting, that whole notion is really what connects to my original thought process. I just think that this one is particularly hard to approach. And I think a lot of people know who Pollock is, but it's just sort of like splatter paint. Like my 5-year-old son could have done that, you know? So I wanted to use a piece that was particularly difficult, I think, and try to like open it up a little bit with some context. And then from Samson, the Soviet poster was state sponsored. I wonder what American posters that were sponsored by the US government looked like. That's a super interesting question. Yeah, I haven't really looked into that. I would, just based on my like thoughts today, I would assume that they maybe put more focus on progress, individual success, maybe like family success over this like uniform sort of authoritarian feeling that came across in the other poster, but I'm not sure. I mean, it would be really interesting to look at, and I'm sure they don't look like Pollock's pieces. I'm sure they're much more figural and have clearer sort of structure to them than this. But that's a really interesting question. I'd love to look into that. And with that, thank you so much for all your questions and your time. Here's a little slide showing you a few more art breaks that are going on in the next few weeks. I really encourage you to attend more. And yes, they're also in the chat. But I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for coming again. Also, feel free to reach out with any questions, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.